And I'm now going to hand over to our Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Ms Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Gillian, and delighted to be with you all this morning. It's really encouraging to see so many different sectors from the education sector from all over Scotland on the call today. I know we have a number of different colleagues joining us today, and I appreciate there will be events ongoing throughout the day. Additionally, I just want to first of all express my appreciation to all of you that work with our young people. I've been really struck in the last 7 weeks by the range of expertise we have in the education sector in Scotland. Many of whom I know who may be working in the teaching sector, but it's not just about classroom teachers. This is about that broader approach in relation to parents and families too, of course, the focus of this morning's event. So I'm delighted to be with you online today to officially launch the new strategic framework for parental involvement, parental engagement, family learning and learning at home. It's not a snappy title, but I think it probably covers all the bases. I'm particularly interested in this work, though, from the perspective of COVID recovery and what that means for culture in our schools at the current time. We had a debate, you might know, yesterday in the Chamber, led by the Conservatives, which very much focused on violence in our schools. And I'm not keen to talk about violence today, but I am keen to talk about behaviour and relationships and what that means for parental engagement, because I think that's really pivotal, particularly in relation to where we are post-COVID in that recovery space and how we can support schools in all learning settings as well in that respect. We already know from some of the statistics that we are starting to see the impacts of the pandemic bear out in relation to early years development, and that's really quite worrying, and there is more I think we will need to do in this space as a government, particularly in relation to how we engage with parents and carers. We all want Scotland, of course, to be the best place for children and young people to grow up, and it's really important we acknowledge the influence that parents and families can have in that respect. And, you know, I'm very sensitive to the word parents as a former teacher, because we always used to be mindful when I was last in school that we didn't just talk about parents. Not all young people have parents. They might be care experience, for example, and that's why we talk about that plurality of what family looks like. There's not necessarily that traditional 2.4 children approach. And I think that's quite important in relation to the stigma that can come with that, particularly for some young people. Now, as I mentioned, families are really diverse, and I think it's important that we have that approach to involving and engaging parents and families that are inclusive and flexible. And I think certainly from my own experience of working in education, some families, some parents had negative experiences of their own education, and therefore that can sometimes impact on the type of relationship. So this is really important that we get it right, because of course research tells us that when parents are engaged in their child and their own learning, that can have an impact on the whole family in relation to well-being. And I think that's hugely important, particularly as we take forward our work in relation to responding to the behavioural challenges I spoke to in the Chamber yesterday. Parents have to be part of that journey. We can't get it right without parents or carers or wider families too. And encouraging, of course, parents to realise and act on their own learning potential, to build on their own achievements and to gain qualifications is really important as well. We want them to have a pride in their own education too, so that filters down to the next generation. We know that fostering and supporting that learning culture within the family can also provide a route out of poverty. And I think this is so important in relation to our work on closing the poverty-related attainment gap. We also know, though, at the current time that families are facing a range of different challenges. I'm very mindful of the cost of living crisis and how that is impacting on the school day, how it's impacting on families in relation to their ability to buy food, their ability to clothe their children. And I know that a number of schools are rising to that challenge, filling a gap that they wouldn't traditionally have been expected to do so. And schools. So as I was saying, I think we also need to recognise the ongoing cost of living crisis and what that's essentially doing in relation to the impact it's having on families and also our children and young people. We have to have that adaptability, I think, more broadly. And right now, you know, I think it's never been a more important time for us all to work together. So today's a really important opportunity in that respect. And I think to Gillian's point, I hope it's not the end of the journey, that this is the start of a number of conversations. I'm very keen that the work of this group helps to inform, for example, the summit that I announced yesterday in relation to relationships and behaviour in schools. It's really important we get this relationship with parents and carers right. Now, obviously, the National Improvement Framework sets out a number of opportunities and focus points for us to try to build that strengthening of capacity for families and improved outcomes for children and young people. And of course, the ability of our children and young people to learn in a classroom doesn't exist in a silo away from their wider circumstances at home and in their community. And the NIF really looks at the ways in which parents and families can be supported to develop the skills and confidence to engage in their children's learning. And I think that also puts a challenge to teachers traditionally, because I know traditionally the role of the teacher was very much in the classroom, but schools have that broader approach to the community. Been in the last 7 weeks. The role of a school is now much more rooted in the community than it traditionally might have been even 20 years ago. And that means the type of support that's on offer to families has changed. So I think it's really important that the improvement actions set out in the National Improvement Framework seek to build on those strengthened relationships and also give us that platform for moving forward in terms of that whole of Scotland engagement at national, local and at government level. And I was at pains yesterday to say that in relation to where we are just now on behaviour and relationships, you know, the government is not in our classrooms. I have people routinely tweeting at me their views on Scottish education. Some are teachers, and I often think that there is a detachment from reality sometimes in relation to the role of government in Scottish education and what happens in a classroom. And I think it's really important that our teachers are empowered to respond to these challenges, but also that we recognise we need a partnership approach in all that we do in education. There's not going to be one single kind of silver bullet in that respect. And as we move, of course, towards education recovery more generally, it's really important to understand that the disruption that's been caused, of course, throughout the pandemic has impacted on parents and families as well as on our young people. I was looking at some research on this earlier in the week ahead of yesterday's debate, and it looked particularly at how younger single-parent families have been impacted, how families in poorer areas of Scotland have been adversely affected by the impacts of the pandemic. That has had an increase then in their own stress and their own anxiety as young parents, for example, but also in their children and in respect of their learning environments too. And I think we need to be mindful of that. We've worked really closely, of course, with partners across education to give a range of support measures to help facilitate recovery. I was chatting to Graham Logan about this only yesterday, about the different approach we took in Scotland in the pandemic to that in other parts of the UK, where, of course, I think down south there was a real focus on tutoring and a different approach, whereas our approach to education recovery in Scotland was much more rooted in support, and that's certainly I think the place that we need to be in as we move forward, because recovery from the pandemic isn't over, and I think we will have a cohort of young people in the system who will need additional support throughout their educational lives, and it's really important that we respect and respond to that too. Now, of course, it's hugely important we hear the voice of parents, families, children and young people. I can think of a really good example in the school that I taught in, not the last school, the school before that probably, where we had a really engaged parent council and very kind of positive working relationship with them in the school. But it's not always the case in every school community. I think it's important we try to foster that collaborative culture. We have that mutual respect throughout our policy building, but we work together fundamentally for the best interests of the children, and our guiding light needs to be that focus. I probably lost count of some of the calls I've been on in the last 7 weeks where we talk a lot about education policy, we don't talk about the kids. And you know, I worked in Education Scotland many moons ago now. Education jargon sometimes takes us away from going back to talking about children and young people, so I'm very focused on that being our outcome here. We need to talk about what's best for our children and young people and recognise that some parents are more engaged than others, so there will be different ways to engage different parents. And school communities are really good at knowing their parents, knowing their kids and reaching out to do just that. Now, in relation to the poverty-related attainment gap, we are starting to see good progress. And of course, the importance of parents and families can't be understated in our journey in that respect. I had the chance, as I think I mentioned, to visit the Royal High School in Edinburgh, where I previously taught, to learn about some of the work they've been nurturing with families and with their wider community. And the work at the Royal High School is markedly different from when I was last in a classroom there over 10 years ago. It's really shifted into a community space. Quite a traditional school, I would say, in the west of Edinburgh, which traditionally would focus on academic excellence. And it still does, but it has a much more nuanced approach to supporting the wider community, I would say, certainly from my visit a few weeks ago. Now, they had a really good approach to tackling the cost of the school day, for example, through their own developed toolkit, creating a school policy in that respect. That's helping to remove financial barriers. We even, I think I spoke about this in the chamber yesterday, have taken away the school prom that used to be run in one of the very expensive hotels we have in the centre of Edinburgh, and is now being hosted in the school. They've got a school kind of swap shops set up where the kids can come and use dresses or suits, hire them out, as it were, free of charge, of course, because the schools managed to have this kind of donation approach to how they can support every young person experiencing the problem. And I think those are really tangible examples of how the cost of the school day is impacting on all schools. And if it's impacting on a school like the Royal High School, which serves a relatively middle-class catchment, then I know it will be even more challenging in poorer parts of Scotland, and we need to reflect that better, I think, in government and, of course, at local level too. The school has a really supportive parent forum. I know this from my time at the Royal High, and that parent forum is really ambitious for their young people. So we need parents and families to be actively involved in decision making, and we need them to feel as though their views matter as well. And I think certainly traditionally, the role of parents in school education was obviously, I think, traditionally seen as an annoyance. It was often battered away, certainly when I was at school. We've moved in the last 25 years in such a direction that brings parents into the school community. And that viewpoint and really the framework recognises we can't get to where we need to in relation to school education in Scotland and the broader approach to education without having parents in the room, without having parents and carers buy-in and support. So we can't achieve those goals in isolation, and fundamentally that partnership. Talk briefly about where we are in relation to education reform. I think it would be remiss not for me to touch on that today. And really engagement in that reform has to be key. I've been really struck by the national discussion, which of course generated thousands of responses. We'll be debating that in the Chamber next Wednesday. And I'm very grateful to every individual and organisation who took part in that wider discussion. But education reform, we've been here before in Scotland. We've been through this process not that long ago, actually. It's fundamentally about changing and refocusing our system. So it's actually future-proof, and also so that it responds to, I think, the challenges the pandemic has thrown in our way, that reimagined approach to education. Now, clearly the Hayward Review suggests a pretty radical departure in relation to what our curriculum could look like in the future, whether that's a diploma or not. And I await the final copy of Professor Hayward's review with some interest, because that will be a real sea change for how we deliver the senior phase in Scottish education. And I think there will be a number of important milestones in the education reform journey. I'm very much keen to hear from you today on what that might look like and how we engage parents in that work. It's really important that our parents are involved, and carers, of course, in that broader look at education reform. And of course, through this area of work, there is a legislative requirement for parental involvement. And it's also the right thing to do if we really want to reduce the poverty-related attainment gap, because we know from research that this can and it does happen in relation to how we can inform policies, but we need to make sure it's done in a meaningful way, that it's not a tick box exercise. So the strategic framework and the practical guidance document has been developed in partnership with a range of partners and stakeholder organisations. It emerged from Education Scotland's knowledge exchange group with the ITE providers and developed into a programme which engaged the expertise of colleagues who work with parents. And I very much look forward to hearing how your work on this develops in due course. Happy to take any questions this morning, Gillian. Apologies for the interruption. I hope my network connection will hold up for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thanks, Miss Gilruth. Mine was dodgy too. I was feeling your pain. I'm going to hand back to Beverly, who I think will chair in the case of any questions. Beverly.
Thanks, Gillian. Nicola's actually going to be facilitating the questions this morning. Are you still with us, Nicola?
Yes, I'm here, Beverly.
Thanks.
We have a few questions for the Cabinet Secretary that have been submitted by our audience, and I think we've got around 12 minutes left, so we'll see how we get on in working through these. The first question for the Cabinet Secretary is: Scotland is recognised as having a world-leading legislation on parental involvement. Now that the framework has been published, what does the Cabinet Secretary see as being the next steps for the system?
Thank you. I don't know who the question's from, Nicola. Do you know who it's from?
It's from one of the people in the audience who have registered, and we asked for questions on registration, so that the person doesn't want to ask the question.
Okay, I'm a teacher. I like to know people's names, but anyway. Okay, so obviously I think we should be proud of what we've already achieved through our approaches to parental involvement and engagement in Scotland. And I know we've had international interest in that respect. I think involving and engaging parents in their children's learning is really at the heart of all that we do. But ultimately, this framework isn't going to work unless people use it. So I think everyone on this call has a responsibility and an obligation to get the framework out there and into our school communities, and that we see it engaging in relation to supporting practice. We're really good in Scotland at writing education policy and writing documents. We did a lot of it during Curriculum for Excellence. And I think really framework documents only work when they can be brought to life. So we need to make sure that the framework document itself helps to support better practice fundamentally going forward. I think we've got really good examples of strong practice right across the sector, but I can also think of some where they probably need a bit of support in relation to how they engage their parents. And I think the framework document, I know it's been really well received by all involved. I look forward to seeing how the system uses it, but it's important we make sure, and I certainly will be as Cabinet Secretary, encouraging people to use it, that it's not something that sits on a shelf, that it's something that people use in their day-to-day practice.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Our second question is from the Scottish Parental Involvement Officers Network, and I'm hoping we have Katherine Farrow, the chair of...
Yep, I'm here.
Lovely. Come on in, Katherine.
Just checking my connection. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Delighted to ask you a question on behalf of our national group. It's affectionately known as Spy On, so it's quite a funky title. So if you hear that, then that's what it is. I'm also a Quality Improvement Officer in Glasgow City Council, but asking a question on behalf of the group. So the Learning Together National Action Plan is almost 2 years out of date. Leaders and local authorities have been waiting on this plan to develop their own local parental involvement and engagement strategies. It will also be important for supporting the planning and developing of family learning and learning at home programmes. Can you please provide an update on whether this is being progressed, and if it is there a date for publication?
Thanks, Catherine. I think you've asked a really important question. So obviously the pandemic meant that some actions from the Learning Together Action Plan were paused due to focus on education recovery. I mean, I think I spoke in the chamber yesterday about this. They've been critiqued by the opposition on why we hadn't published it yet. It will publish later this year, the Bristol research, but similarly, some of this work was paused and impacted as a result of the pandemic. But the previous plan has now concluded, so we are continuing to work with the Learning Together Steering Group with Education Scotland and other stakeholders, including, of course, Spy On, to develop that refreshed policy framework for parental engagement. That will sit alongside the broader education recovery strategy to improve parental involvement and engagement in schools. I'm very keen, though, Catherine, that this work doesn't sit in isolation to where we are on behaviour at the moment. And it really strikes me that this work could help to inform some of where we get to in relation to behaviour and relationships, because we can't possibly develop further policy in that space without having parental buy-in and support. It just won't work. I mean, so as an action point, certainly from this meeting, I'm keen that we take that away. I know my private secretary's on the call, so we will certainly take that away to education officials in the Scottish Government to look at how we can tie the work of Spy On into that behaviour summit, because I'm very, very keen that parents are involved in this. We, are responding to substantial, I think, challenge at the moment in relation to changed relationships in schools. I don't like the opposition's mischaracterisation of it necessarily always looking like violence in schools. I don't think that's the picture. I think there are examples of extreme events in schools just now, which you all have seen in the press. But more worryingly, I think, are low-level things involving really distressed behaviours from our young people. And I know that some parents are struggling as well. So I think this work will be key to informing some of the work on the summit on behaviour, and it's certainly keen to take that away additionally as an action from today.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Our next question is from the National Parent Forum of Scotland, and I'm hoping Cheryl Bernett is on the call, the chair of the NPFS.
Hi Nicola, hi Cabinet Secretary.
No,
Our question is, our National Parent Forum representatives advise us the experience and inconsistency across Scotland and how Scottish Government policies are implemented, for example, additional support needs, wellbeing, you're talking about behaviour specifically, and how parents and families are involved and engaged in these. Will the Cabinet Secretary tell us a bit more about her thinking and how the framework could actually go and support improvement across Scotland?
Cheryl, I think were you on Good Morning Scotland yesterday?
Yes, I was.
I was listening to you in the car on the way into to work, and I actually quoted you in the chamber yesterday. I don't know if you know that, but
Yes, I did. I seen that.
So, because I thought the point you made around about partnership is really important. We expect schools to do everything. We expect them to solve all society's ills, and there comes a limit. And actually, that broader approach, that community approach, and yes, that means parents will be key to resolving where we are on behaviour, but so many other issues. So you spoke about ASN, wellbeing. So I worked as a teacher in Fife Council, in Murray Council, and in Edinburgh City Council. 3 different councils, 3 different approaches to doing things. So when you talk about that variance, yes, I recognise it. Now, you know, if I was to talk to COSL right now, they'd say, well, that variance is a strength. Every individual authority delivers things in different ways, and that's the strength of how we run local government in Scotland. And I accept that point up to, well, I accept it to a point, but your point about variance in relation to how young people experience the system isn't really acceptable. And if you look, for example, at some of the attainment data and the gaps that exist in certain parts of the country in relation to variance, there are real challenges in certain local authority areas in Scotland. And one of the points I was very keen to make yesterday in the debate about behaviour is the Scottish Government is not delivering education in their schools, it's our local authorities. They have statutory responsibility to deliver education. So they have a key role in this. And to your point on variance, I think is a really interesting one and actually really important as well. I don't want to make this entire contribution about that behaviour summit, but when we're talking about different ways of responding to the same needs in different parts of the country, I don't think that's fair in relation to giving every young person an equivalence of access to the support that they should be expecting. So obviously the framework, I think, is a key role in that respect to driving a level of parity in the system. But the framework will only work in that respect if it is developed and supported. So Education Scotland, I think, have a key role in that respect to developing and supporting a national understanding of its implementation, so there isn't a variance. So I think actually the inspectorate have a role in that regard, because when they go in to inspect schools, they should see a consistent approach to these national policies, for example, that exist, as you cited. And I think, more broadly, we need to engage our local authority actors in this too. And one of the things I've been struck by, I think I just heard from Katherine, who's a QIO, is a reduction in the number of QIOs in the last 10 years and what that looks like at local authority level, because local authorities have a responsibility to qualitatively assure what goes on in their schools. So if there isn't still that middle level of support that previously existed, that gives me a concern as Cabinet Secretary around your point on consistency. And I'm really keen to take some of this work forward through education reform, because I think that gives us an opportunity to do things differently, but as you say, to inform a more level playing field. So the framework helps to support our workforce in taking forward a more consistent approach, but our workforce needs backup from their own management teams, from QIOs and local authorities, and then across the whole of Education Scotland, or whatever we will call the replacement organisation, through the reform process, the national agency that will provide a level of understanding, I think, will be really pivotal. And part of that too will be around professional learning. I think Gillian mentioned that at the start of the call. So getting there to be a better understanding across the profession of what parental engagement looks like will be key. And the framework is the starting point, but it's not the end point.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm aware that we're working towards a 10:30 timescale for your time. Would you be willing to take another question, or would you prefer to leave it there? Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. The final question we've got for you this morning, again, was submitted in advance from a delegate. Given the publication of this new document and the prominence of family learning across policy, how does the Cabinet Secretary think we can capitalise on this focus to embed family learning across sectors to drive improvements for families?
So family learning, I think there's a great opportunity for us to better embed what family learning looks like and what we mean by that. We know that the research is really clear on this, and I know one of the speakers I think today is going to be talking about this. Now, I very much value that approach, and I think we can see through our policy landscape, so whether it's the NIF or the Attainment Challenge or the Adult Learning Strategy, we can already see that approach embedded across what we aim to deliver. I think the first thing is to use the framework to bring that more consistent approach, as I think I responded to Cheryl on, around about the professional learning offered to staff. So what does that look like? And that in turn will support families we engage with right across the country, and it will do so in a more consistent way. And another way we can drive forward family learning in Scotland is to draw on one of the key features of that approach, which is partnerships. Again, I think Cheryl spoke about yesterday, working in partnership, using expertise of practitioners from across the sector too. We also have a occupational standard that sets out expectations around what competencies, skills, knowledge and experience practitioners need to have to support our families. So I think it's safe to say we have lots of different opportunities to take forward and to raise the profile of family learning in Scotland. But I suppose family learning and the benefits that stem from that need to be communicated to the profession, the educational profession at large. The framework is the way in which to do that, but I think professional learning will be really key to unlocking some of this so that people working in our education sector recognise and understand that when they have the buy-in of parents, carers and families, they actually are able to better support the young people in front of them.